Welcome to Kick Scammers, the show where we normally chat about the scams, the crooks and the terrible Kickstarters, Indiegogos and GoFundMes to ever exist. We're closing in close to 100 videos covering these terrible campaigns, and you know what? I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everyone that has supported me over the years uncovering these scams, with an extra shout out going to my Kick Scammer Detective Agency on Discord, link below, because you know what? And this may surprise you, I actually love Kickstarter. Indiegogo and GoFundMe, not so much, but Kickstarter, when used correctly, I think this website can actually be a proper godsend. As you may or may not have known if you are new to the channel, first and foremost, I am a gamer, a retro gamer, and I actually think that right now, or whenever you decide to watch this, there ain't no better time to be a retro gamer. You got huge blockbuster games coming out nowadays that look and play better than ever before, that will of course please one half of the community. And for those like me that prefer the simpler days of pick up and play arcade style games where unforgettable experiences were in a lot of cases created by small groups of individuals or even just one or two bedroom coders, well, that's more rampant now than it's ever been. If you're in that boat and you're reminiscing about that game or genre that you used to love playing, well, newsflash, it's almost guaranteed that someone out there is making a new game just like that, but they're using better tools to do so, and in quite a few instances, they are getting funding to make it happen from you. So today, not only am I going to push aside the scams, but I'm also going to be pushing aside the obvious Kickstarter success stories as I bring you this long overdue 10 incredible Kickstarter games that you didn't know came from Kickstarter. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. And one final thing, I know I say it quite often, but please do hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. My analytics tell me that well over half of my watchers are not subscribers, so if you want to support the show and see videos like this, ain't no better way to do that than by hitting the big red button. And the bell too. For fans of classic racing games, Slipstream should look very familiar. Of course, plenty of classic games like Outrun, Top Gear, or even newer games such as Horizon Chase Turbo will of course come to mind when you see this one, and for good reason. The game obviously takes inspiration from those classic titles, with its real draw being the gameplay mechanics itself. Ducking and diving between cars at breakneck speeds, drifting around corners, and of course gambling whether to slipstream behind rival cars to get ahead does take a little bit of time to get used to, but very quickly becomes way more addictive than you could possibly imagine. For retro fans, you may be surprised to hear that the game actually plays a little more like Outrun's sequel, Outrun 2, which I actually prefer, as you spend an absurd amount of time essentially drifting sideways around the corners. However, due to the draw distance not being as far-fetched as that game, you can sometimes find yourself spinning around one corner and then not doing so well as the track spins around the opposite way. To combat this, the game features a very aesthetically pleasing rewind mode that can only be used for a short while, but of course, the better you get, the less you will need to use it. The game obviously started its life on Kickstarter back in December of 2015. It only asked for $6,000 and it got it, just by pulling in $6,869. What I love about the game, besides the game itself, is the fact that only one guy, besides the soundtrack, made it. And the Kickstarter showed fairly regular updates about how the game started off as an experiment to see if he could replicate those older sprite scaling games of yore before turning into something unique and truly special. Honestly, I doubt this one's gonna sell gangbusters, as it's quite bare bones, but games like this have always been bare bones. You play, you see how fast you can do it, and then you try again. For fans of the genre, this offers enough of a gameplay change-up while still feeling familiar. Definitely give it a shot. Paradigm is a comedy adventure point-and-click game, similar to the classic point-and-click games of old, and similar to other games on this list, it was created by just one guy, or at least the majority of it was created by just one guy. It's actually quite tough to decipher. Regardless, your job in the game is to go on some pointless journey to fix a computer. However, as meaningless as this sounds, it's not about the destination. As you know, it's all about the journey, and in this game, the characters and interactions you have along the way really do make the game shine. The writing is simply fantastic and completely unforgettable, as it should be. The characters are overly weird and completely unique, and even though, again, it is pretty short, the most important thing is that it keeps you engaged during your entire playthrough. Well worth checking out if you haven't already. And heck, if you are one of the 1,387 backers that supported it, give yourself a pat on the back for this one. If you're a fan of games like Monkey Island and Day of the Tentacle, then you owe it to yourself to check out this game. Hey there guys, you're probably wondering where number 8 is, right? Well, before we get into that, I just want to save you all some time. All of you people out there that are starting Kickstarter campaigns and are going to be messaging me for advice. I get this all the time, and on the back of a positive kick scammer video, of course it's going to be happening again. I'm not the go-to guy for this. I've never run a Kickstarter myself. However, this month's sponsor is definitely going to be helping you, and that company is, of course, Skillshare. These are the guys who are here to help you on your crowdfunding journey, and if you're one of the first 1,000 people to use the link below, you will receive your first month completely for free. Guys, if you're launching a Kickstarter, this is an absolute must. It doesn't matter how good your product is, if you don't promote it, no one will ever see it. Plenty of campaigns absolutely smash their goal, to then find out that the majority of the money is either going to Kickstarter fees or the company that helped promote them. Why not dodge all of that and do it yourself? Learn everything from creating a successful video for your campaign, another absolute must, to simply succeeding at crowdfunding full stop. And of course it doesn't just stop with just crowdfunding advice. Learning how to promote yourself on social media, discovering how to increase traffic through different sources can pretty much apply to any kind of business or hobby. From growing a YouTube channel, getting more people in your shop, or simply just wanting more eyes on your creation. Click that link below and make sure you use the code SlopesGameRoom at the checkout to get that first month for free. But right now, let's get back to number 8. Lonely Mountains Downhill is one of those games that's dangerous to play. No matter what other AAA title I get for my Switch, Lonely Mountains Downhill is just so goddamn addictive that if I do decide to give it a quick go, then that becomes the game I'll be pretty much playing consistently for the next month or so. So imagine my delight when I discovered that Lonely Mountains Downhill started its life as a Kickstarter. It asked for only 35,000 euros back in October of 2017, and it raised 45,042 euros. Now, mountain bike gaming may not sound all that interesting, but let's face it, before the days of the PlayStation 1, I'm sure skateboarding games sounded a bit crap too. But just like the Tony Hawk games, Lonely Mountains Downhill takes what is a very niche thing to do and turns it into an extremely addictive single-player experience. There's no music, there's no one else except for you and you alone. One very polygon-heavy avatar that has one mission. Start at the top and get to the bottom as quick as possible. The left analog spins the bike into whatever direction you're facing, and the action button gives you a small burst of energy needed to make certain jumps or to speed across the few areas of straight that you're going to be getting in these locations. Like all of the games mentioned so far on this list, this game is all about the pick up and play nature of its gameplay. After you've made your way down with no timer, now you got to do it with a timer. Now see if you can do it even quicker. Now see if you can do it without crashing. Now see if you can do it without checkpoints. It's not an easy game, but thankfully you are given so many challenges for each stage that even the hardest of hard levels, without you even trying, do eventually become second nature. I'm so surprised more people do not bring up this incredibly addictive game that eventually got published by the awesome Thunderful Games, a studio that I follow religiously due to the SteamWorld Dig series. And even though this is a simple game, the year I got my super rare copy of the game, it actually made its way into my top 3 of most played games of that year. It really is that good. Now, I'm not going to chat about this one too much because it's fair to say that I'm probably becoming quite annoying every single time I bring up Xenocrisis, a title that I've not only covered in full with its own review, but also a title that I own physically, not once, not twice, but 4 times. And the soundtrack. And no, I'm not going to be going getting that Neo Geo copy. You gotta draw the line somewhere, guys. So in short, Xenocrisis, the top-down arcade-like shooter with the Halo or even Alien-style pixel art and absolutely ear-melting soundtrack originally designed for the Mega Drive/Genesis, is still probably in the top 10 games for that system. And it's only on the top 10 list because nostalgia's in the way, pushing more obvious classic titles above it. Because if this game came out in the 90s, it would likely be in the top 5 or even possibly the top 3 games for the system. It really is that good. But again, I did a review on it already, and I'll leave a link below if you want to go and check that out. The cool thing about this game is that it obviously started its life on Kickstarter. As always is the way with these new games on retro hardware, Xenocrisis asked for a humble amount of money, that being £20,000, but it ended up getting £72,569 back in December of 2017 by Sega retro collectors like myself that wanted new titles for older systems. Since then, the game has of course been released multiple times via different companies, and Bitmap Euro, the developers themselves, have started to work more closely with Numskull Games, releasing titles such as Baton Axe, another successful crowdfunding game, which is a pretty awesome, albeit way too short, top-down shooter game, and of course you've got the upcoming Final Vendetta, which is a typical Streets of Rage style game that you can be damn sure I will be covering as and when it's released, as it not only looks pretty damn good, but the soundtrack, oh my god guys! Created by one of my favourite DJs/producers, feature cast and the occasional odd extra track by the Utah Saints. From what I have heard so far, this 90s electronic dance LP is going to be worth a purchase on its own regardless of if you get the game. Just check out this small Prodigy inspired snippet and imagine how good it's going to feel listening to this music whilst playing this new Final Fight experience. Ah boy, is this game awesome. If it's not Metroidvanias or arcade racers that take up a lot of my personal gaming time, it's hardcore precision platformers. If games such as Celeste, The End Is Nigh, Super Meat Boy and even the hardcore platforming sections of Ori and the Blind Forest are up your street, then you will feel right at home with this game. Similar to those titles, especially Ori, the big mechanic with this title is the jumping, or at least this game's version of the jumping. You essentially send big beams of light that send you shooting into other directions before you need to flip around and shoot the opposite way to collect or attack. One more go, just one more go. You probably know already whether a game like this is for you or not, but I can assure you that if any of the titles mentioned seem up your street, then of course this humble little Kickstarter that only managed to raise $33,884 of a $25,000 goal is without a doubt worth a look. In fact, like quite a few of the games mentioned on this list, this title was also picked up by one of those small publishing houses, that being PQ, who have also picked up another game I recently backed called Curse of the Sea Rats, which although is still not released, does go to show that the company has a good eye for picking up titles like this. As and when the game comes out, you can be damn sure I will indeed be sharing my thoughts. And here's one for my UK home computing retro gamer followers that grew up on games like Uridium for the C64. An explosive new twist for the time of those classic arcade shooters that did wonders in reviews and of course spawned the odd sequel and a whole heap of pirated tapes because of it. The original game was absolutely legendary, right up there with the Turrican series in terms of showing off what the system was capable of. And besides that one still pretty good sequel well over 30 odd years later, it's back on Kickstarter as a spiritual successor known as Hyper Sentinel, created by the original team for all major platforms. The game needed £15,000 and it gained £21,068. Still, it was a success, it was released, and as it's on this list, it obviously did well within its niche. If you're up for a seriously hard arcade shooter that's similar to classics such as Defender, but honestly a fair bit harder, then of course, this one is for you. The Pedestrian needed $21,000 and it got $30,318 back in January of 2017. What you have here is a very light platforming game where you control the guy on the toilet side. Nope, really. Thankfully, this overly simple concept turns into a really intriguing puzzle platformer as your character can really only just walk within the world of its own metallic signs. You'll need to master the paths your pedestrian will take in order to reach the goal very quickly. The game becomes less about the platforming and more about the working out how to connect all of the signs together, and in quite a few instances, the end result will actually affect the real world around you. One great way of looking at this is it's kind of a 2D Portal game. It's one of those incredibly clever indie ideas that you almost never see from the big publishers, and that's a shame. Thankfully, when looking back through the Kickstarter itself, you have a whole heap of updates given to the backers showing the game's progression. And sure, even though the game is short, those few hours spent completing it will indeed stick with you as the game becomes more complex the more you play it. If you ask me, this, as well as the vast majority of other titles on this list, is the perfect Steam Deck experience. This game is well, it's kind of a Metroidvania. It's also possibly a survival horror. Maybe a bit of a Dark Souls-like game too? Yeah, whatever it is, this game is, in my opinion, the absolute poster child on how small indie-based games should be run on Kickstarter. Asking for $25,000 and gaining $63,255 back in January of 2014. Whenever this company would post updates, which happened roughly every month here or there, I would always look forward to them. Seeing how the game changed from the still sweet looking but very basic game into the super intricate final game was always a pleasure to experience. For me, that's what makes the platform so good, if you find the right project, that is. In the game, you are given practically no instructions on what you need to do. You scurry around each screen, running from fantastically well-created AI monsters to another fantastically created AI monster that will quite literally kill you at a moment's notice, whilst you continue to work out what you need to do. The first order of business is to literally survive, running from bad guys, eating bats and dodging the rain. Everything is out to get you in this game, and honestly, it's quite uneasy for the first few hours. However, if you do like games like the ones previously mentioned, you will actually find quite a lot of depth here with this title. It's actually bloody brilliant. You eat what you can in order to survive long enough in hibernation, and you will need to do this on loop in between hibernation points, which really are the only safe places to go before the world gets overrun with rain and you die. The better you get at doing this, the more the world opens up, and the more you explore. Thankfully, that exploration never gets boring as your moveset becomes way more natural to you. In fact, the moveset of the Slugcat is pretty much unparalleled in any other 2D game I have ever played. It really does become quite addictive. In short, the game is not for everyone. In fact, I would say it's actually for quite a unique group of indie gamers. But if you do get sucked in, you will become quickly absorbed into this world way more than you may expect. 663 backers put their money behind Neofid Technologies' Demons of Asborg Mega Drive game. The Kickstarter was asking for €35,000 and it raised €44,835. And here it is. The absolutely stunning looking Mega Drive title with great music and some of the smoothest animations with these size sprites is an absolute joy to look at. The moves of your character are also pretty top notch, I must say, and the packaging is also right up there with the best of the newer modern Mega Drive games. In the game, you control a knight called Gareth on a quest to defeat the bad guys. It's all very standard stuff, let's be honest, and at its core, it's really a pretty standard action platforming Metroidvania that requires gaining new abilities in order to move on in the game. I'm very happy to say that the game feels incredibly smooth to play on the old tech, something that a lot of new games for old systems struggle with, and no matter how many new abilities you obtain, that always stay true even in those later levels when power-ups really do start to become quite experimental, with one particular power-up giving you the ability to take over enemies for the most part to reach areas that you can't due to your size or the inability to fly. Of course, I understand that these retro games on retro systems tend to be given a few extra brownie points simply because they are on those systems, but by this point, so many games have been made for classic consoles that it really is quite easy to spot what's good and what's not. And I'm glad to say that Demons of Asborg is a good game no matter what platform you decide to play it on. If these sorts of games are up your street, then you should definitely check out this one. In fact, its reviews were so good that a sort of sequel, or spin-off if you prefer, has more recently been showcased on Kickstarter after the success of that first campaign, and that game more than doubled its funding goal over the first campaign. And yeah, once again, you can be damn sure I'll be checking that one out as and when it's released. Back when the Switch was a new thing and I had less than, say, I don't know, 10 or 15 games for the system, a long time ago, one of the games I imported from the States was a very cheap platforming game called Tiny Barbarian DX. If you want an incredibly minimalistic platformer that feels super tight and will of course give a great challenge, then Tiny Barbarian DX is for you. You can of course take control of a tiny barbarian in a rather big world. There really isn't much of any cutscenes, but instead, in true classic platforming fashion, the basic story is told by what happens in the game as you play. There are only really two buttons in the game, jump and attack. However, like any good platformer in this day and age, the challenge starts off quite nice, easy and breezy before becoming quite brutal in later levels. It's one of those games that's going to make you lose your mind trying to work out how to tackle each area. It's been a long time since I've played this game, but it's still so much fun several years after buying it on the cheap, and honestly, I had no idea it started off as a Kickstarter. A tiny little Kickstarter back in 2012, making it easily the oldest game on this list. Just look at how humble and old school this Kickstarter campaign video was that again was created by just one guy 10 years ago.
Hi, I'm Michael Stearns, and I'm making a game called Tiny Barbarian. It's not just any game though, it's a sword and sorcery retro action adventure unlike anything you've ever seen. Well, it is a bit like other newly made retro action games, and it is a little bit like sword and sorcery short stories, but I really like that stuff, and if you're here, then probably you like it too. So, let's take a look.
The campaign video goes on to explain the origins of the game, how he has beefed up the character's animation and even added some new moves, and with the help of you, the backers, he would be able to complete episodes 1 and 2 of the game. These efforts resulted in the Kickstarter gaining a tiny $15,457 of a $12,000 campaign, and more importantly for him, it resulted in a publisher jumping in to physically release the title, injecting even more money in to create episodes 3 and 4. For me, this is what it's all about on Kickstarter, supporting young developers who then hopefully take you along for the ride, showcasing the ups and downs along the way during its process. And There you have it, guys. Just 10 of many incredible games that, on the grand scheme of things, didn't really earn much money at all compared to the major success stories that you're more used to. But thankfully, due to their hard work and, of course, support from the community, most of the time, less than 1,000 people per project were able to grow these games into something rather excellent. I always get comments from people saying that they will never use crowdfunding to support anyone, as these platforms have way too many scams, and you know what? I fully understand. That's why this Kick Scammer series has done so well for my channel. There are literally so many dodgy campaigns that have come from the big three, and it seems I'm never going to be running out of projects to cover. However, giving credit where credit is due, the platform has also helped plenty of incredible game developers get noticed by giving them the backing needed to release some brilliant titles. And best of all, as a backer myself to quite a few of these campaigns, watching the backers only updates go from struggling to get demos ready, releasing early versions, getting the community to vote on stuff, getting published, and eventually getting released is worth the price of admission alone. Please do take care when using these websites. Use your detective skills to see if the company or individuals behind the campaigns are to be trusted, and then, and only then, do continue to support the ever-growing indie scene, however you decide to do it. Links to every game I just mentioned in this video can be found in the description. Let me know down below what other great Kickstarter video game stories that you have been a part of. Hey there, guys. Many thanks for checking out the video. This is the usual part of the video. I'd like to give a massive shout out to all of my patrons, with an extra big shout out going to all of the usual peeps that you see along the bottom of the screen. Let's give these shout outs. We're going to give a shout out to Aaron Gorman, Agro Crag, Akatimo84, Andrew Dalton, Arista, Benjamin Guy, Big Rico, Bran Perez, Chev Matic, Chris the Shapeshifter, Christopher Devero, Clan Bob, Conrad Constantine, Da Action Saxon, Dina81, Game Apologist, Gary Pinkett, Ian Quell, Intrigued Gaming, a Tiki Teacher, the Ashen Knight, Jay is Manchild, Jabba Al Aiden, James, Jeff Mianowski, Jeremy Bauer, Jeremy Rodriguez, John Yaskatus, yep, I'm sorry if I've got that wrong, Josh Evans, King Link Reviews, King of Carrot Flower, Lucas Softail, Man Shovel, Matt Jackson, Michael Ridley Dash, Mike Fallon, Mind of the Unsane, Nicholas Bertner, Nick Pollard, Overjoel Zane, Roll VP, Ray Blair, Retro to Next Gen, aka Lou, Richard Alderjick, Rovan Army, Sir Nielsen, Shade Silent, Shadow Dragon, Solix Captor, Stephen, Taylor Rainwater, That Gamer, The Cunning Linguist, The Sneaky Ferret, Tim Lum, Todd Pulfo, G, Vita Sparnes, Vike Echo, Wobble the Bean, The Wonder Ducks, and Ye Old Hamburglar. Like I said, guys. Massive shout out to all of those awesome people out there that are supporting the video. Thank all of you that are supporting the video simply by watching it. Thank you guys so much. If you like this content, the absolute best thing you can do straight away is hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. And if you want to go that one step further, get your name shown, get your name shouted out, come and see what I'm working on, see all of the videos before they go live, and get access to the exclusive Slopes Game Room passworded website. Then there'll be links down below for you to become a Patreon and YouTube member. You guys decide. Yeah, for me, I just want to say a massive thank you to you all. But until next time, guys, this is DJ Slope signing out. And hopefully, I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye. When looking at the world's most popular video game fighting games, several games come to mind. But of course, when it comes to 3D fighters, very few pull on the nostalgic heartstrings as much as Tekken. A franchise is still going strong to this very day, with 7 mainline games and more spin-offs than the competition combined. For better or worse. Welcome everyone to the Complete History Show, a show where we look at some of your favourite video game franchises from yesteryear, and as the title suggests, we're going to be looking at the complete history of the Tekken franchise. So let's get ready for the next battle with Tekken, where we'll be looking at its roots, its history, its inspiration, its development, and of course, every single one of its games. This is Tekken, the complete history. Welcome to Slope's Game Room.
But before going ahead, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of you people out there for watching the channel this year. I've done some pretty big complete histories this year, quite a few kick scammers, and I've got some even bigger projects coming in 2022. And also, let's give an extra big shout out to the Patreons and YouTube members that allow me to create these videos. Videos that they get to see early, they get to see me actually working on them from time to time. They get exclusive rooms in the Discord, and most importantly, they get to watch these videos without any adverts or sponsorships. Raid Shadow Legends are the sponsors for this video, and my god, do I love Raid Shadow Legends! The greatest mobile game of all time! Do you want champions? I bet you do! Well, lucky you! Because Raid Shadow Legends has over 600 champions! That's double minus 80 to the amount of gold medals given out at the Tokyo 2021 Olympics. Big number, right? That's right, a very big number of champions that all come from their own unique factions with their own history within the world of Teleria. How crazy is that? Oh, well, you know what's even crazier? The new clan boss, Hydro, has 6 heads, with each one being its own boss. Blight, Torment, Mischief, Wrath, Decay, and Suffering. Oh, get ready to gasp. What I like about Raid Shadow Legends most, besides the sheer crazy amounts of champions, is simply looking at those champions, studying them, deciding which champion is best within each faction, and working out which one to take into battle, going up against specific mechanics of a specific dungeon boss. And not only do you guys get to have your very own super limited edition champion by clicking that link in the description, but on top of that, esports legend S1 Pool has an even more super limited edition champion that could be yours if you log in every day for 7 days before January 28th. And if you miss out forever. But never fear, whilst you're doing that daily, you get to have plenty of holiday fun, as Raid is stocking filler packed full of festive goodies like special events and tournaments, and even some more fusion events. There's seriously never been a better time to get started with Raid Shadow Legends. Hit that link in the description and you'll get the epic champion Aina, 200 silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in the game. All of this treasure I just mentioned will be waiting for you right here, and it's as simple as that. Links are in the description. Anyway, enough of all of that, let's get on with the video.
The year was 1994. Movies such as Speed, The Usual Suspects, Shawshank Redemption, and Ace Ventura: Pet Detective were blowing up at the box offices, and it seemed that even gaming had hit the big time, with the wildly popular Street Fighter series getting a movie of its own. Regardless of what you think of the outcome of that movie, there was no getting away from the franchise's popularity. Street Fighter was simply big business, originally catching people's attention back in 1987 with the original release, but by the time its sequel came out, there was just no getting away from its immense popularity. Not only was everyone trying to copy this exploding formula, but even Capcom themselves had released not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 official spin-offs to the sequel, and that's not even counting the really obscure spin-offs.
Of course, what came next for Capcom was the Alpha series and every crossover that came with that. And as great as these games are, retrospectively, there's no getting away from the mindset of a 90s kid. 2D fighters at the end of the 90s, what we wanted was 3D fighters, because 3D fighters definitely looked better. Apparently.
Yep, the legendary Yu Suzuki had already blown people away as he always did by releasing Virtua Fighter a year prior. A game that, although still kept the fighting mechanics in a 2D plane, really did shake up the playing field with its super blocky 3D world.
And of course, with Street Fighter completely dominating the 2D field, bringing it to the mainstream, and with Virtua Fighter bringing the 3D fighter to the mainstream, every company under the sun wanted a piece of the action, and Namco was no different.
Katsuhiro Harada was the guy put in charge of this Virtua Fighter and Street Fighter fighter. A young chap who had always had a fascination with video games. His parents never purchased him his own machine as a youngster, and he was scared about visiting the arcades too often in case he ever got into trouble by his teachers or, of course, his parents.
But that didn't stop the fascination.
After being dragged out of the ruffian-filled, sweaty arcade centres a few times, he finally got the message. He locked it all away and knuckled down. He got himself a decent position at Waseda University studying psychology, but no matter how hard he tried, there was just no getting away from it. Video games kept calling him.
Before you know it, with no parents around to tell him otherwise, Harada's son spent the majority of his free time playing video games.
The urge was simply way too strong. It was about this time that he gave up on his studies in order to go down a path of video games, not creating them per se. I mean, he had experimented with this in the past with little to no success, but instead, Harada's son wanted to find a job where he could continue playing video games. This led him to a job at an arcade, promoting events and doing marketing, most notably for Street Fighter tournaments. And with his psychology degree behind him, he actually became fascinated in mastering the behaviours of other gamers, working out what drinks kept the players playing longer and what position or location to put the machines in order to get the most amount of playtime, aka the most amount of income from said games.
But of course, once he mastered this, he wanted to continue on his working/playing video game path, which is a pretty hard thing to do when you have absolutely no qualifications in the field.
But that didn't stop him, as he continued to smash out CVs to every major studio possible in order to move up the video game ladder. I applied to Namco, Sega, Capcom, Taito, Square, and many others. I didn't think I really wanted a job with Namco, but they were the first company to offer me a job, so I accepted it. Of course, being a sales rep for Namco wasn't the end goal, and according to an Edge interview, his parents actually broke down in tears when they found out that this was the path he had taken. Thankfully, after a year of smashing sales,
Record-breaking first-year sales, I might add,
he had finally got the approval of his video game-hating parents and, more importantly, the higher-ups at the company. So much so that he got himself another job joining a new team in game development. The group had not long finished up with the game Knucklehead, yet again a rather forgettable, mostly 2D arcade beat-em-up that hadn't done all that well, further proving to the company that the time to move on was now. 3D graphics, polygons, and motion capture was the future of gaming, a future that everybody agreed on. The problem was that nobody was really any good at actually doing it. You see, at the beginning of Tekken's life, the game was nothing. It wasn't even a game. It was a small team at Namco trying to understand this new style of gameplay, testing out how to create 3D models and, more importantly, actually implementing those models into some kind of video game. A fighting game was the obvious choice for the test case, especially considering the team had just finished up with that Knuckleheads game, and on top of that, several members had just directly moved from working on Virtua Fighter at Sega and were now working on this.
On top of that, they had the well-respected Namco employee Yanaka Kanoi, who would eventually go on to work on the previously mentioned Point Blank series.
Anyway, the game was progressing along at a snail's pace. Virtua Fighter was blowing arcade goers away on Sega's own Model 1 arcade unit, and the sequel, which would soon be released, was going to use the even more powerful Model 2 unit that cost Sega $2 million, that's $3.5 million by today's standards, in order to simply just get the chips needed to develop it.
In other words, Namco was in trouble.
In order to compete with Sega, the initial idea was to release the competitor on Namco's System 22 arcade board, released a few years prior, that was most well known for Ridge Racer. But if they did this, not only would they be releasing a game that is obviously not as powerful as Virtua Fighter, but it would still be incredibly expensive.
Thankfully for them, they had a close working relationship with Sony.
Namco's managing director, Shigeshi Nakamura, had been working with Sony's top dog, Ken Kutaragi, on their move into the video game console space. Of course, they already had got their toes wet working in the 16-bit generation, but after the fallout with Nintendo on the never-released Nintendo PlayStation, and the unwillingness of Sega's Japan leg to create a Sega/Sony console, Sony ended up working with Namco to create an arcade board that used the best parts of the System 22, but made it cheaper and easier to port for the upcoming Sony PlayStation.
What they essentially just created was a beefed up version of the PlayStation hardware in an arcade unit. In other words, they were bringing the arcade experience home once again.
Tekken would eventually be released on the 9th of December 1994 in Japan arcades, and almost a year later on the Sony PlayStation, where on Western shores it almost got a name change to Brave War. Looking back in those early days, it's hard to envision a world where Tekken, a brand new franchise, could ever take on the already established and far better looking Virtua Fighter 2, considering that machine was released a month earlier. Sure, the game was fun, and some would argue that it's actually better, but this was the arcades. Who in their right mind would choose these clunky graphics over the super slick Sega offering?
Well, the answer is simple. It was cheaper. Sega's arcade game was definitely better looking, but Namco's was significantly cheaper. I personally remember not really seeing Sega's arcade game too much, maybe once or twice, but Tekken, that was a mainstay at every single bowling alley I ever visited.
To the average onlooker, it was another 3D fighter, but it had some important changes that made it incredibly unique, and everyone that ever played these games would instantly recognize that. Virtua Fighter was continuing on with the pretty standard 3-button layout. You've got a guard button, a punch button, and a kick button. It worked in the arcades, and it was perfect for the Saturn controller layout. Tekken, however, was different, as it needed yet another button to use and gave the player the ability to control each individual limb rather than a standard attack.
The hardcore but smaller fighting crowd definitely lent towards Virtua Fighter 2 more in this instance. However, Tekken was definitely more appealing to the average arcade goer. Still, it did offer some kind of decent fighting technique for those hardcore crowd to at least get to grips with.
Understanding the speed and movements of each of the game's limited characters with these controls gave players new ways to chain certain attacks together. Of course, with this being a first game in the series, it's not exactly easy to go back and play, and it's far from leveled, with certain moves being completely unblockable, but still, for the time, it was revolutionary, and the DNA of what would eventually become is, without a doubt, found in the depths of this overly basic game. When looking back at interviews with the core team, it's easy to see why this was so basic. Not only had they brought in a guy that had never properly worked on a game before to balance it, and not only was the majority of the team completely new to this 3D world, but the most important part to take from this history is that it was simply a test. A test to prove to themselves that they could do it.
A 3D character that would respond to your inputs. The gameplay, that was a bit of an afterthought, but still, it turned out pretty well for the time.
In fact, because this was such a new style of game, a lot of the fundamentals, gameplay-wise, were made up on the fly. But practically every single commercially successful game that you can probably think of was made with a design document from the get-go. Tekken had inter-developer freedom, which was essentially a make-it-up-as-you-go-along affair. If you think you've got a cool idea for the game, sure, chuck it in. If you think that idea that your colleague just added was stupid, then delete it. Of course, this caused some serious tension with developers doing what they could to prove that they had that winning formula to beat Sega. And as sloppy as this sounds, it did thankfully provide the top dogs with plenty of options to weed through in order to make this game unique, albeit with some serious hair loss to go along with it. Because of this, he formed a team of the most dedicated Namco staff that would work under him, waking up early and testing out every little thing that they could with each character and doing so until the sun went down, then testing more before passing out from exhaustion on lined up chairs in the office because the floor was too cold.
The end result was a hardcore amount of sleep deprivation, fine-tuning and creating a rather strange game that arcade goers would really get to grips with, as well as PlayStation owners too.
Robots against ninjas, martial artists against bears, sumo wrestlers against devils, and secret agents against the world's worst parents. Yep, that's Hayashi, the bad guy who chucked his kid off the side of a cliff to see if he would survive. If he does, then, and only then, would he be eligible enough to take over the family business. Oh, no Daddy's Day card for you.
Strange doesn't even begin to explain the crazy storyline behind these games. And in fact, what I just told you actually ends up getting changed later on in the series, so dig deep if you really want to.
What Namco just released may have been agonising for the developers and playtesters, but for us early game players, it really was quite impressive, and it felt great too, for the time. Sure, they may have fibbed a little saying that the characters were motion controlled when really the technology to hand was so primitive that they only really captured limb movements, and even that had to be reanimated frame by frame in practically every single instance, but it didn't matter. Everything within the world of Sega vs Namco had just gone crazy. Daytona beat Ridge Racer with its 60 frames per second, and Tekken just did the same thing when going up against the original Virtua Fighter. Plus, this new style of gameplay and that crap crazy character lineup made this game far more accessible to the average onlooker.
It was stupid, and it was fun.
Sure, the competitive fighting scene would most definitely lean more towards Sega's offering, especially with Virtua Fighter 2, which is an all-round much better game, but for the average Joe, Tekken was winning the battle. Thankfully, this new 4-button controlling your limbs layout style that changes up the formula more than you may think, which we will get to in more detail soon, as basic as it was, did birth many other 3D fighters that pushed the controls even further into the hardcore realm of competitive fighting. But again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves,
because next up, we have Tekken 2.
Released less than a year later in Japanese arcades and roughly a year later on the PlayStation, depending on where you lived, this title managed to bring in quite a few of those ideas that the team wanted to implement in the earlier game that was either voted against or simply deleted by a disgruntled team member. Oh, and in case you were wondering, yes, that same making up as you go along approach was present here too. Heck, if it worked for the first game being the first ever PlayStation game to sell 1 million units, why not do it again? This mentality resulted in Un Takumura, the original designer of Yoshimitsu, reviving a character that was left on the cutting room floor the first time around. Unfortunately for her, she ended up leaving during the development, and that's why you can't play as a giant penguin in the sequel. No, seriously. And before you call that stupid, let me remind you that one of the developers actually made another stupid character at home in his spare time to show to his colleagues who loved it so much that they all rallied together, and that's why you got a fighting kangaroo now within the world of Tekken. Thankfully, some genuinely great additions also got implemented with the characters, comprising of around 800 polygons each, and taking between 3 days and a week to model each character, which obviously doesn't sound like much nowadays, but back in the day, this was a big deal. The ability to roll in and out of the background rather than just towards or away from your opponent also helped further push this into a true 3D fighter. The game was less stiff, the movements felt fluid, chaining those combos was a lot more accessible here too. You could grab your opponents from all angles. If you was good enough, you could even perform a teching move that would get you out of being grabbed, and although it's obviously not as fluid as Tekken 3, it's head and shoulders above what came before it. No longer do you have simply arcade or versus, but now you have practice, you have trial, team battles, time attack. That PlayStation version had unique CGI endings, a remix soundtrack. It truly was everything that fans of the series wanted from a sequel. A lot of the sillier ideas ended up getting implemented into this game if you knew how to unlock them, but thankfully the comic-style speech bubbles that would pop up and say stuff like, ouch, did not, thankfully. Yet again, the game became a huge seller for the PlayStation, and the magazine Maximum actually went to visit the studio whilst this game was in development, and they reported on Tekken 3 already being in development. Provisional title.
I didn't think our marriage would survive.
It was really awful. Both of us kept everything pent up until one of us would just explode.
Hey, stupid! What kind of a meal was that? Then we discovered Tekken 3. This is for 40 years of macaroni and cheese.
That's for never saying I'm sorry.
And this is for your mother.
That's for the loser that you are, Patrick. Thank you, Tekken 3.
Obviously, that was what it was called, and here it is, in my opinion, the best Tekken game ever released, because it's the one I played the most. Tekken was an already established franchise by this point. Sony's PlayStation was winning the console wars at the time, and because of that, more people knew what Tekken was. It was a fun game that anyone could pick up and play with little to no skill levels in fighting games. However, it had started, more so with number 2, becoming something that competitive gamers were really enjoying. In short, if Street Fighter was the go-to 2D fighter, Tekken was becoming the go-to 3D fighter. For the majority at least. As stated, one of the reasons it had done so well and captured the attention of all gamers, no matter your skill level, was because of its Virtua Fighter roots. Seiichi Ishii was the designer and director of these first 2 games, but after the release of the, yet again, million-unit shipping sequel, he left the company and created Dream Factory, who went on to create titles such as Tobal 1 and 2 and the awesome but never forgotten The Bouncer. Actually, you know what? It's been a long time since I've played this. I'm a little scared about playing it again because my guess is that it's aged rather bad. Anyway, with Ishii-san out of the picture, Tekken 3 needed a new guy completely in charge, and that person would be Katsuhiro Harada. You remember him, the guy whose parents kicked off that he wouldn't get off his arse out of those arcades. Well, he's back again, and this time he's in charge, and for anyone that's ever played the third entry, you will understand why this guy in particular is so important to the franchise. Tekken was loved by pretty much everyone, that budget fighter that was hard to hate on the most successful system of the time. But now, with its hardcore fan base behind it, why wouldn't Namco push and make this third and final entry for the system a premium product? The first big step was that Tekken 3 was created on the newly designed Namco System 12 arcade board, which was essentially a beefed up System 11 board, PlayStation's original hardware, but on speed. The character model's limbs were no longer separate from the torso, but instead became a single polygon filled character, and finally motion capture was implemented correctly this time, in order to create the smoothest characters that the series had seen so far. But of course, they still took some serious liberties here. Pro wrestlers came in to clean up King's movements. Hwoarang Su did a fantastic job bringing newcomer Hwoarang to life, but without a doubt, the most notable use of motion capture done right was when they brought in Marcel Herrera. Marcel was a capoeira instructor, and a very good one at that. A blend of martial arts, dance, self-defense, gymnastics and music. He had just done a seminar on the sport, and unknowingly to him, Namco was in attendance and decided to bring him in to capture the unique fighting style for the game. And the result was Eddie Gordo, easily Tekken's most successful character and without a doubt the most hippity-hoppity of the bunch.
Now, to be fair, the end result wasn't exactly to Marcel's taste. He only ended up giving it about a 6 out of 10 because it didn't represent the sport very well. The clothes were wrong, the naming of the character was wrong, and the naming of the character's moves were also wrong.
On top of that, the fact that this new style of expression was used 100% for fighting worried Marcel, as the sport had so much more to offer than that. I mean, let's be honest, when have you ever seen a bar fight turn into a smooth breakdance beat 'em up? Almost never, right? Regardless, this new style along with the new graphics, improved roster, sound, and well, everything else pleased everyone. And I do mean everyone. Characters like Eddie not only attracted newcomers, but they were brilliant to just pick up and play. And on top of that, it was the smoother sidestepping of all characters that really grabbed the attention of the hardcore gamer. This was a maneuver that wasn't exactly unfamiliar in other 3D fighting games, but here in Tekken, it completely changed up the way pro players would interact with each other, even more so than in Tekken 2. And this with the quickly discovered dash moves that only the hardcore gamers of the world knew how to pull off, and further additions in the balancing and countering of all players. And you've got a game that is literally going to please everyone.
Even those gamers that wanted stupid characters, because let me tell you, this game had them.
Slinging a couple of fun modes like Tekken Ball, which is essentially Tekken meets volleyball, originally designed to teach players how to air juggle their opponents, and Tekken Force, which is a pretty much bare-bones beat-em-up style game that I was obsessed with back then, primarily because I loved that series and had played a memorable game in the genre since my Mega Drive days.
Until I played the Bouncer, of course.
I think Tekken 3 wasn't just a slightly better game than 2, it was a groundbreaking turn for the series. The new management and the team as a whole wanted to give PlayStation owners the best fighter that they could. Virtua Fighter was for the most part still dominating the arcades in Japan, but in the world of home consoles, Tekken reigned supreme. It's hard to find a fighting game, even to this day, that packed in quite as much as this one did. If you wasn't a fan up to this point, you were now. To many, including several team members themselves, the new graphics, music, and heck, even the killing off of a huge roster of fan-favourite characters in place of new ones didn't make this the third game in the series. Tekken 3 was the beginning, a game that wasn't just Namco's attempt at 3D fighting, it was a dominant series that the competition, including Namco themselves, desperately tried to replicate.
After the release of Tekken 3, the franchise was firmly established as the franchise that was going to be milked dry. And let me tell you guys, within the world of Tekken, that's nothing but a good thing. For the most part.
Because up next, Tekken went to another system for the first ever time. And no, I'm not talking about the PlayStation 2. yet. Tekken Card Challenge came out on the Wonder Swan back in 1999. In this title, you play as several characters from the third game, wandering around a fog-filled world, reveal said world as you explore, looking for the exit and going up against several foes as you progress. As the name suggests, this is done very simply in a card-style fighting match rather than a more fisticuff style that you're no doubt more used to.
Essentially, it's Top Trumps.
Your number, which is selected by a spinning dial, shows one of your 4 cards, and if that card has a bigger number than your opponent's card, congrats, you can continue exploring. The feedback was pretty hard, probably because people wanted another Tekken, right? Well, come on, set your expectations. It's not that great of a fighting game, obviously, but as a card game, I don't know, it's pretty average, I suppose.
Thankfully, the world didn't have to wait too long for a true sequel to be released, and my god, was it awesome.
Master, am I not the greatest fighter in the world?
Kung Fu is strong, Ponskipper, but the Tekken fighters are stronger.
What?
Heihachi is a thundering storm. Xiao Yu rides the wing of the gray. Nina strikes like the snake. And Yoshimitsu's sword cuts the wind.
I will defeat the Tekken fighters.
Tekken Tag Tournament. Rated Team for Team.
Tekken Tag Tournament yet again took what made the previous proper game so popular and essentially smashed it together into arguably the ultimate greatest hits for the series, up to this point. On top of that, the game refined more of those controls, balancing a few of the characters for the hardcore community, and as the name suggests, they added the almighty tag gameplay mechanic.
Now you can link together some of your favourite characters and switch between them on the fly.
And you can do all of this using the new PlayStation 2. Tekken had never looked so good. Sure, the arcade release of 3 had beautiful backgrounds, but in order to get that working on the OG PlayStation, they had to go back to having a panorama static image. Well, that's no longer the case. The game looks stunning and it plays just like the last game.
Now, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to shoehorn a little bit of a personal history into this segment.
Tekken Tag Tournament meant the world to me on a personal level. It was around about the time that my parents were going through a very messy breakup, and to make matters worse, the pub that I was living in at the time with my parents literally kicked us out on the streets with absolutely no warning, not giving us back any of our possessions until some crappy thing was sorted out between the parents and the landlord owner, which I won't get into here. Regardless, this forced us to quickly move into our own rented property with practically nothing to our name for a month or so, besides my binders of music, which I would use to DJ and would literally carry around with me everywhere, and a few clothes and not much else. If you're picturing Chandler and Joey in the living room with garden furniture eating takeaways, you're pretty spot on with what our house looked like at the time.
Could we be more wet track?
It was a tough couple of weeks. Garden furniture in the living room and an old telly that we'd found from somewhere sitting on a load of old cardboard boxes in the living room.
It was indeed a struggle, but we made do with what we had. And then, all of a sudden, we got a phone call. Your PlayStation 2 pre-order is ready to be collected with SSX and Tekken Tag Tournament.
Both of these games helped bring us together as a family during a really hard point in our life.
We didn't have much, including memory cards I might add, but we did have each other, and in a weird sort of way, looking back, it was Tekken Tag Tournament that was the glue, and I will always hold TTT close to my heart for not only being a good game, but for being such an important part of my life. Anyway, back to the history. TTT was and still is utterly fantastic. Of course, with this being a bit of a mashup, it came with its fair share of unbalanced characters that are essentially a bit stupid and unfair to play. That is, if you knew who to choose. However, as this was a spin-off title to the main game, this unfair playing field actually helped with the title's obscure nature. The cinematic opening with the incredible music will always be cemented into my brain, and although I must admit that I was very disappointed with the majority of the characters not getting their own CGI cutscenes, the game itself was just way too good to ignore. Fans of the series like this game so much, in fact, that an HD remaster was released as part of the Tekken Hybrid many years later. However, for fans wanting a true sequel in the mainline Tekken franchise, you wouldn't have to wait too long, because in 2001, we got Tekken 4.
Silence! I hope you're so wrong. Because now you've done it. You have grown strong, Egg. Prepare to meet Iron Skillet.
Oh yeah, Tekken 4 is here. Punish your enemies with new moves, interactive environments, and new fighters. It's a legend so deep, no one just plays it, they live it. Tekken 4, rated T for teen.
The game brought with it a far more hardcore fighting style, with yet more refined controls, counters, and maneuverability. Most notably, the side walk rather than the side step. The graphics look noticeably better, with the spinning backgrounds essentially disappearing completely in place of full 3D environments that you can actually collide with and in some cases interact with. Along with the changes in characters' movesets, Tekken 4 did what it always set out to do, and that was to please everyone, no matter how much of a hardcore gamer you was. If this was your first time playing, then you're gonna have a good time, and the mashing of those buttons would actually result in something happening on the screen. But for the hardcore gamer, the new additions, as small as they seem, really did push the possibilities of how a game like this can be tackled. You see, when a 2D fighting game has a punch, a kick, and a guard, it technically doesn't matter what side of the screen you're on. You're looking at a mirror image of the same image. When you give each of your 4 limbs a button in a 3D space, then it becomes more complicated. And as the series moves on, players start using this to their advantages and obviously their opponents' disadvantages. Think about it like this. The player on the left's right arm is actually further away from the opponent than the right player's right arm. In the original games, it really didn't matter too much, but as the series turned into a more competitive fighter, rather than being a simple showstopper, things like this became important, and the developers constantly messed around with this new fighting mechanic in order to further complicate it, and it was Tekken 4 that really did mix it up. Again, to the average gamer that was just having a laugh with a few friends, a few beers, it didn't matter, but to the hardcore crowd, it did matter. Good or bad, you were going to be having a good time with this game nowadays. But back then, this game wasn't exactly loved. The crowd was incredibly split on this title, and the reason for this isn't all that easy to pin down. In previous games, it's all about you versus someone else, doing it as fast as you can, chaining combos together in later games, and doing it with a more refined gameplay style. The silly characters of number 3, adding even more crazy mechanics, and of course the crazy big roster of characters in Tekken Tag Tournament. 4, on the other hand, slowed down the speed a little, which forced you to get up close and personal more often. The music seemed quite chilled in comparison to the up-rocking tunes of the previous entries, and the roster, honestly, it did leave a little to be desired. Plus, as sexy as the motion comic-style cinematics were, many fans, including myself, wanted more CGI-filled endings, like the perfect for the time Tekken 3. In a nutshell, from what I can tell, it just wasn't the big leap that Tekken 2, Tekken 3 or Tekken Tag Tournament was. It did bring a few extras, and those few extras really did separate the crowd. Again, if you was a casual gamer, it didn't matter, but to those hardcore gamers, not so much. Thankfully, retrospectively, people have gone back to Tekken 4 and seen it for what it was. A really good, interesting, experimental release in the Tekken franchise. Tekken Advance, however, well, that's a different story. Tekken was all about taking 2D and keeping it 3D, and obviously this was going the other way around, and the end result is actually, well, it's actually super impressive. Expect this bad boy to turn up on a Stop Skeletons video one day, because although the game itself is obviously 2D, going for that same Donkey Kong Country pre-rendered sprite-styled look, the gameplay is mostly intact, and they did it with a 2-button system. Of course, playing a game like this is virtually pointless in this day and age, but credit where credit is due, until the PSP came about, Tekken Advance was a more than adequate way to play Tekken on the go, if you was the average Tekken consumer. Pro players? I wouldn't bother. Not only did we get Tekken 4 the same year in 2001, but 3 years later, you got Tekken 5.
You guys gonna like this one?
Not everyone knows what it takes to be the king of the Iron Fist tournament. Tekken is back with the best graphics, craziest combos, most playable characters, and most modes in franchise history. Tekken 5, rated T for Teen.
Whilst those hardcore Tekken fans continued to fight over the questionable design choices found in Tekken 4, the less questionable Tekken Tag Tournament continued to rise in popularity. Namco knew that they had to bring back the old fans, taking away the seriousness that was Tekken 4, and in true Tekken fashion, they went dinosaur fart crazy. The roster, the stories, the music, and more importantly, the gameplay felt more Tekken than it ever did before. The game was created using a brand new engine for the series and was the final entry to have much of any arcade presence outside of Japan. That original game was created on Namco's 256 board, which, as stated, didn't see much love outside of Japan besides this game and Time Crisis 4, in case you was wondering. Less gritty realism is what they wanted, and vibrant fighting worlds were the order of the day here. Yes, it was a little bit stupid, but it was great. Tekken 5 was a complete showstopper, even on the less powerful PlayStation 2 hardware. It was attractive, it was fast, it was still a little unbalanced to be fair, but just like all previous entries, it attracted gamers from casual to hardcore. It was great fun, no matter what step of the ladder you perched on. To fix the balancing issues, as well as a few cosmetic changes, the arcades got an update known as Tekken 5.1 or Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection, which us home console gamers got on the PSP and eventually as a downloadable title for the PlayStation 3. Full 60 frames per second gameplay on a handheld, this was something truly to behold. And heck, the PlayStation 3 version was obviously even better looking. To many, this was the ultimate Tekken experience. Nothing else came close, well, besides 7, but again, that depends on who you're talking to. Yet again, you've got more balancing, more modes, more characters. It is without a doubt the most intense Tekken to date. When you start getting down to the nitty-gritty of how many frames certain moves take, this is essentially the turbo of the series. Without a doubt, it was the most competitive, and even on the PSP, which obviously came out first, it looked great, and more importantly, controlled great, especially if you got the Japanese or American version of the PSP game that actually came with a D-pad overlay that would actually help the player use the system's rather small buttons with ease.
Now, I've personally never got the chance to actually try these out because for whatever reason they weren't included in the release in England, but hey, apparently they're good.
Both versions ended up becoming found on numerous top 20 lists for both systems.
Not bad for a download-only title for the PlayStation 3, am I right?
And even though it took some serious time to make it onto the platform, it was 2006 by this point. Hype was already welling up for the next entry in the series, Tekken 6.
However, between the release of Tekken 5 and its port, we only gone and got ourselves 2 official spin-offs, didn't we? Kind of.
Namco Cross Capcom was the first major title that the two companies collaborated on, and, well, it wasn't really Tekken, was it? It featured a whole heap of characters from both companies back catalogued in a sort of confusing action RPG game, and of course you got some Tekken characters thrown into the mix because of this. In its country of origin, the title was beloved, surprisingly not due to the RPG mechanics that would actually become quite tedious the more you played it, but more so for the stories. Fans love seeing these characters that they knew and loved interacting with rival companies' beloved mascots, and even though it was a little too niche to ever get a Western release, the game started a chain reaction of crossover titles that we will soon venture back to a little bit later on in the video.
Because the other game that was found between Tekken 5 and Dark Resurrection was a game called Death by Degrees, without a doubt the weirdest spin-off in the entire Tekken franchise. Now, fighting games moving into different genres isn't exactly a new thing. We already discussed the card-based Wonder Swan game and the RPG, but this is what happens when you try and turn it into an action-adventure title. Originally known as simply Nina, because that's the only character you get to play as, this obscurity doesn't play nor does it look anything to do with the Tekken franchise. Heck, when Mortal Kombat did the same thing, there was at least no mistaking that this was from the Mortal Kombat universe. You've got that big iconic logo, it even says the words Mortal Kombat in a decent enough font size too, but here, sure, it says Tekken 2, only really noticeable if you plant your face right up against the box, but the character herself, considering she changes her appearance several times over the course of this series without being too harsh, Nina looks no different than the majority of blonde-haired CGI girls that were included for no other reason than to prove that sex sells. There's nothing that stands out here. If you was a passerby in 2005, the same year that the 360 was released, my guess is that you would have just picked it up and put it straight back down before moving on. Which is what most people did. The game did not sell well at all.
It was ambitious, I will give it that. Heck, even the story, if you're after that sort of thing, is actually quite good for this sort of game. But not only did it not look like Tekken, it didn't play like Tekken either. The reason they called it Death by Degrees, other than linking to the story slightly, was because the moves performed by Nina were controlled by using the right analog stick. Now, I suppose the idea works in a 3D space with each room flipping cameras, similar to how Resident Evil games work. However, when you suddenly change the screen, using a directional method isn't the best way to go, as those directions obviously change direction. It is without a doubt the game's biggest flaw. Thankfully, you do kind of begrudgingly get used to it eventually. It just always feels like a chore to play.
If I'm honest, I actually quite like that this game exists because it's a nice spin-off into a franchise which is primarily just fighting games. It just needed a little bit longer in development to really make it the great game that it wants to be. There is a great game hidden beneath here, which unfortunately, obviously, they couldn't do in 2005.
Worth checking out if you run out of Devil May Cry and Resident Evil games, I suppose. Just don't expect anything to do with Tekken here.
Right, let's get back to the mainline games, shall we?
Whilst Dark Resurrection was still in development, Tekken 6 was also in development. The first true game to be made for the next-gen series of consoles. The first mainline game to branch away from being a Sony exclusive. Apparently due to fan requests, and finally the first to be made in the arcades on the new System 357 arcade board. Now, according to Namco themselves, the response to that arcade original was higher than it had ever been for any Tekken game in the franchise. But when fans saw that first trailer, they weren't sold. Thankfully, by the time the game was released on home consoles, it had so much extra padding that it was pretty hard to not like it. A huge roster of characters with a crazy amount of customizations, online gameplay, and plenty of modes to boot. The end result is a game that continued to please casual gamers, but started to not do so well with the hardcore scene.
You see, the big problem with Tekken 6, besides its loading,
Get ready for the next battle.
is it is an incredibly unbalanced game, more so than any other game in the franchise to date.
Not only has the Tekken team got a whole heap of characters to try and level out, but you also have a rage-like meter that will increase your character's ability the lower your health gets, making you, the worst player, more powerful again. Casual gamers may not mind this, but veterans found more flaws than ever with this new gameplay style. The story mode, which was essentially a 3D Streets of Rage-like game, really didn't feel all that good either, no matter your skill level. Unfortunately, you would actually need to play through this mode in order to win any decent amount of in-game currency that you would then use to customize your character and stand out as unique during those online matches. Matches that, at least at the time, were reportedly pretty damn buggy and would quite often kick you out of the game. It may sound like I'm raging on Tekken 6, but that's not the case. In fact, I do remember when it came out spending quite a lot of time on this title because I was just enjoying it for what it was. It's only when you go back and play it alongside what came after it, or even before it in some instances, that you realise that even though it looks very pretty, it really is quite forgettable when compared to its other entries. Which sadly can also be said for Tekken Tag Tournament 2. Talk about an unbalanced mess. Even more characters are in this game, and although that may sound impressive due to the sheer quantity on offer here, some of the characters are almost the same as other characters, just with a changed skin. Learn how to play that one character to the best of their ability, and essentially what you have is a juggling mess of the same character with 2 health bars. Of course, it had its fans, like all entries did, especially those of the Nintendo variety who got to play the game on the brand spanking new Wii U in its exclusive version. I had this one too, I've got to admit. Upon release, I enjoyed it. And you know what? You guys probably did too. Looking back, the majority of review sites did, getting mostly favourable reviews for the time. They praised the 720 gameplay, the huge roster and always relevant pick up and play style of the game. But they also mentioned the higher than normal barrier that was needed to truly master a game like this. And looking back, this was probably why it sold so badly. The game was a massive flop, financially being the worst selling game in the mainline franchise so far. And although you may have enjoyed it, the hardcore fighting scene for the most part did not. And that hard to learn tagging mechanic did push away more than it pulled in. Tekken was quickly becoming a series that wasn't for everyone. Sure, perhaps the casual gamer that hadn't played a Tekken game since maybe PlayStation 1 gave it a go, and the hardcore Tekken fanboy would obviously pick it up. But besides that, the hardcore community wasn't a fan, and the average casual consumer had moved on as well. Thankfully, if you was a hardcore fan, you had plenty to consume. The game was released early in demo form on the previously mentioned Tekken Hybrid that featured an HD remake of the original and a demo version of Tag 2. But on top of that, you also got a 3D version of the Tekken movie, Blood Vengeance. Right, ready to go crazy because Blood Vengeance is just one of 4 Tekken movies. Let's go. The first movie came out in 1998 and was a Japan animation title that's perfectly 90s anime. Not good 90s anime, but instead completely forgettable. Terrible fight scenes, the majority of the characters are not in it. It's horrifically dubbed. Yes, it's kind of enjoyable, mainly because of all the reasons I just mentioned. And next up we have the live action flick, released in 2009, and goddamn did it bomb, with a $30 million budget and only gaining back 1.7 million, and a Rotten Tomatoes score of 0. Now, to be fair, that is a little harsh. Sure, the movie is super cliche and the story is super forgettable, but honestly, it's better than you think. Of course, it's far from the best one-on-one video game fighter adaptation that goes to the Mortal Kombat original and the remake, along with the Street Fighter movie and Street Fighter 2 anime. But Tekken, I gotta say that I personally didn't mind the film. Sure, if it wasn't for that Tekken name, it would be completely forgettable, but hey, it does have the Tekken name, so whatever. It takes more than a few liberties with the franchise, which isn't necessarily a bad thing when you think about it. But for a mostly direct-to-video film, I generally do not mind it. Good enough fight scenes, mostly recognisable characters, and a forgettable story, grab some beers and you'll no doubt have a good enough time with this one, just like I did. The next film was the one found on Tekken Hybrid, Blood Vengeance, and what you essentially have here is a response movie to the live-action flick's terrible feedback, made by the same company that made the most recent game's cutscenes, and most importantly being way more true to the original storyline. Take that however you want to take it, because in all honesty it's good enough for what it is, as long as you have plenty of beers, because just like the games, it's stupidity at its finest. And that finally leaves us with Tekken 2, a prequel to the original live-action flick that honestly was more of what I was expecting with that original flick. My god, is this film bad? Originally envisioned to be part of a whole new franchise of Tekken films. If you took out all of the lost-like flash-forward found in the movie though, you would have absolutely no idea that this ever was a Tekken movie. Hey, maybe it's why I really don't mind the original too much after watching the sequel. I don't know, because even though that film had some serious issues storyline-wise, it was at least still a recognisable Tekken movie. This, not a chance.
Honestly, I doubt that anybody that's watched those first 3 Tekken movies are thinking to themselves, oh, I really hope they make a prequel. Look, if you guys just want some more Tekken cutscenes, go and watch the Tekken cutscenes instead. Definitely better than that 4th film. Anyway, back to Tekken Tag Tournament 2.
Tag 2 did bad, like really bad. The franchise was hurting, it was bleeding money, and unfortunately there really is only one thing you can do to fix that in this day and age, right? If you're thinking about making a comeback, yeah, that actually did happen. But before then you had Tekken Revolution, a free-to-play Tekken game. And by the way, this is not to be confused with the confusingly named Tekken, which was another free-to-play game for mobiles, which actually doesn't play all that badly considering it's a mobile game, requiring you to swipe and tap instead of clicking buttons, waiting for your special moves to replenish on the bottom right before you can tap them and execute. Like I said, it's really not terrible, things considered. They probably did the best they could with what they had, just don't expect wonders here. Anyway, back to Tekken Revolution. A game full of mostly reused Tag 2 assets, and a game that actually, on paper, it works. Sure, most people associate the series with home consoles, but its roots were in the arcade. When you booted it up, you were given a couple of virtual coins, you would drop them in a virtual slot, and that let you play a couple of matches. Once the coins were gone, you would have to wait a set amount of time, and the coins would replenish. Of course, you didn't need to wait if you put your own money in, just like Candy Crush. The game was stripped back to its core, it was a simple one-on-one fighter, and to be fair, it did offer you a lot, considering it was a free-to-play game.
I mean, that makes sense. They had all of the assets ready to hand from Tekken Tag Tournament 2, right?
Exactly. And along with some balancing of those Tag 2 characters and the obvious removal of the tag feature itself, the game did, of course, feature something new. Why wouldn't it? And that feature was the invincibility move. Now, you may have heard me say this 1,000 times already, but for newbies and button mashers, that's not all that bad. But annoyingly, the invincibility move was literally what it said on the tin. 99% of the time, you couldn't counter it, meaning that you were going to be going down if it was used against you.
And just like all previously questionable titles in the franchise, this new feature took us 1 step forward and 2 steps back, because sadly, what you actually have here is actually a really good idea for a free-to-play game.
Along with the ability to boost your character's power to 200, which also completely broke the game, it also included bloody RPG mechanics, because apparently every Japanese game eventually needs to include them, resulting in randomized hits offering critical attacks at random, which is completely stupid for a competitive fighter. Now, to be honest with you guys, I'm doing this part of the history based on others' reviews. I did play it briefly myself back in the day, and besides quite a few dropped matches, I didn't see too many issues myself, but sadly I can't go back and play this anymore because, as you would expect, it's no longer available. However, please do keep in mind, as much as the hardcore community found ways to complain and break this game, it was still fairly well reviewed by the average consumer, and a lot of what was found in these more recent titles did in fact pave their way for the true return that all fans, hardcore or casual, would enjoy.
But before then,
Tekken 3D Prime Edition was a pretty decent looking Tekken game that kept its 60 frames per second gameplay even with the 3D on, and was actually one of the better looking games for the system early on. As a quick one-on-one fighter, it's actually really not that bad at all. As a full game, it's very much lacking. Only worth getting if you're a hardcore fan or a 3DS collector, as this always seems to be quite cheap. Random Tekken characters found their way into Namco's Anna Kournikova Smash Court Tennis. Full Boko Heroes X was a mobile RPG that featured several Tekken characters too. Galaga Tekken Edition was a thing that actually existed and was released on the 20th anniversary of the first game, where old school players would remember you actually got to play a mini version of Galaga whilst the first game was loading, and if you completed the game without missing a single enemy, you would unlock a special character. And therefore this new mobile game that may seem a little bit pointless actually is a nice little history piece. The previously mentioned Pac-Man Fever was a terrible Mario Party clone that of course featured Pac-Man, a whole heap of deformed characters from within the world of Namco alongside, of course, Tekken characters. You had Tekken characters playable in the often overlooked Smash rip-off PlayStation All-Star Battle Royale. A couple of characters from the world of Tekken found their way into Point Blank 3, again previously mentioned on the Complete History show, nudge nudge. Pokken Tournament is definitely worth at least mentioning, as it was made by the same company and shares a lot of its mechanics, and its name is quite literally a blend of Pokemon and Tekken. Just like all previous Tekken games, this one is surprisingly fun no matter your skill level, and has a decent amount of depth to what many would consider a pretty bare bones game. Pro Baseball for Mr. 2011 is one of quite possibly thousands of Japanese baseball games, and this one features some Tekken characters. Apparently, Project Cross Zone is a follow-up to the previously mentioned Namco Cross Capcom game, although this one is even better because it features Sega characters too, as does its sequel Project Cross Zone 2. Smash Court Tennis Pro Tournament 2 featured a few characters from the series. Of course, the world's greatest roster ever to be found in gaming also featured a Tekken character, as Kazuya gets ready for the next battle in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Tekken Arena is a completely forgotten Tekken MMORPG that I had no idea existed, yet here it is. A game where you earn in-game currency by flicking a static image of your character towards a static image of another character. This game honestly has less to do with Tekken than the WonderSwan card challenge game, if you ask me, which actually did kind of get a sequel on mobile phones with Tekken Card Tournament, that yet again lets you choose your cards, aka your moves, before watching the world's slowest Tekken match unfold in front of your eyes. Tekken Command Battle and its sequel, Tekken Command Battle 2, tries to do what Typing of the Dead did by getting you to type commands faster than your opponent in order to win a game. What was surprisingly cool for the sequel was a mode called Tekken Radar that would use your phone's GPS system and let you know if passers-by also had the game, and therefore allow you to juke it out on the streets. You have no less than 9 Tekken Pachinko machines that we all like to moan about, yet look utterly dazzling to me personally. Tekken Resolute is a surprisingly well done Java mobile Tekken game. Of course, it's extremely hard to play, but the sprite work and ability to play via Bluetooth made this a Java favourite for the time. Urban Reign was a strange mix of PlayStation 2 era wrestling games and a 3D beat-em-up brawler style package that of course featured some Tekken characters. Weirdly, the PlayStation 1 game Xevious 3DG was a polygon heavy top-down shooter that again featured Tekken characters.
And finally, you've got Street Fighter Cross Tekken and Tekken Cross Street Fighter. Yes, they are two different games. Right, okay.
Street Fighter 4, completely reviving the one-on-one fighting scene more than any other to that magnitude, this boosted several other companies to do the same thing, including Capcom themselves, and Street Fighter Cross Tekken was eventually announced. Boy oh boy was this a confusing mashup. Both games had their fans, but as stated in the video already, they played incredibly differently to one another.
The marketing was obvious. Two of the biggest video game fighting franchises duking it out in the same game. However, speculation definitely started setting in when people saw the first reveal.
Especially when another game called Tekken Cross Street Fighter was also said to be in the works, this time from Namco, which again had the fan base excited but dumbfounded at the same time.
For those into the fighting scene, this was really obscure. I suppose for people outside of the fighting scene, the best way I can describe it is if someone like, I don't know, Sega released some kind of Sonic the Hedgehog racing game up against Mario. It would be completely stupid.
But anyway, regardless of the confusion, the hype was real. Capcom put some serious money behind the development and the marketing of this game, and the CGI cutscenes are absolutely breathtaking, giving us those Roger Rabbit vibes within the world of gaming. But then it was released, and depending on where you pre-ordered the game, you would get serious advantages to your character based on the game systems found in various collector's sets. Now the gem system, without going too in-depth, gives your characters the ability to improve their fighting style, their speed, their defense, and what have you. Meaning that this was without a doubt the most unbalanced mess of a game released in Tekken's life up to this point. Along with hidden characters that were promoted on the lead up to the game's release only to be unlocked if you actually paid to unlock them via DLC, made this a truly unacceptable entry in the Tekken and Street Fighter universe. The game was also extremely unbalanced as stated, which was the real nail in the coffin for the title. Thankfully, Capcom did pull a 180 for the title, offering a free update that heavily fixed the game a year or so later, but by this point the fans had moved on. Namco had already put their version on hiatus, and since then they've cancelled it, and although it left a bad taste in the mouths of many at the time, if you do see it on the cheap, I actually do recommend that you pick it up. What you will play will 100% be more Street Fighter than Tekken, but that's a given. I really like what the game turned into. It's just a shame that the good version of this game came out so very, very late.
Leaving one final game to talk about, and that is of course Tekken 7. At this point in time, the most recent Tekken game to date. And boy golly gosh, was it a return to form for the series.
Would you believe it? Fans just wanted a decent fighter. All of the elements added over the last several installments ended up taking away from that. Whether you was a hardcore or a casual consumer, someone was going to be getting upset, and Tekken needed to win back the lot of them, which is exactly what they did. Sure, the game itself didn't exactly explode with extra little features like previous games, but it did what it set out to do. The core game itself was simply fun for all skill levels. Sidestepping has never felt so good. The free roaming of the third space is something you will all quickly take advantage of very early on in your Tekken journey. The rage is now cleaned up with rage-specific moves. You've got those cinematic burnout-like slowed-down sections which surprisingly do not get in the way of the gameplay. You have an absurd amount of customizations, and the unlockable cutscenes from the previous games that really do make a long-time fan of the series like me stupidly happy are all present here. Sadly, the story itself is a little lackluster with this title, and for me, the payoff of completing the game with each character is terribly mundane. It's something that forced me to play with extra characters in previous games, but now I'll just stick with who I'm good at. A lot of the extra features that the fans wanted did eventually get added in the form of DLC, sadly. But besides its flaws, it truly was the definitive Tekken game that fans wanted and the hardcore scene craved, bringing back its rightful place as the technical man's fighting game. Find the right opponent and you quite literally have an infinite amount of gameplay with this title. There you have it, guys, the complete history of Tekken, one of the simplest 3D fighting games turned into the most complicated 3D fighting game for those that are willing to sell their entire game collection and only focus on this one series. Or you could be more like me, the average consumer that just enjoys it for what it is, one of the most fun and accessible fighting games ever to grace home consoles, a fighting game series that helped define the new kid on the block PlayStation, which of course would become a mainstay going up against the mighty Sega and Nintendo. a series that, like many others, has had its fair share of missteps, but at the same time, it has stood the test of time with its standout titles. Tekken 7 is that standout title, and it is the build-up to everything we've been playing since about Tekken 3. And although it's very unlikely to be the end for the franchise, for me, it is the perfect way to round up this complete history.
Hey there guys, thank you for checking out the video. This one was a long one. I've been working on it for a very long time, but you know, I'm always rewarded the most when I create these massive complete histories and I'm able to really put the time and effort in. So yeah, thank you guys if you did make it this far into the video. And of course, as it is this part of the video, I'd like to give a massive shout out to all of the patrons and YouTube members that actually allow me to create these videos. So thank you to every single one of you, and I hope you've had a great holiday and a great new year. I've got plenty of even bigger complete histories coming next year, thinking about it. Some of the ones I've got planned, and some big kick scammers as well. So thank you to all of you guys, with an extra big shout out going to at BitGamer88, Aaron Gorman, Agro Crag, Andrew Dalton, Arista, Benjamin Guy, Big Rico, Bram Perez, Cheshire
Red
One,
Bull
Chris the
pulling out
Shapeshifter,
all the
Chris Walker,
Here come today's
Christopher
winners,
DeVero,
the team
Clan
of
Bob, Conrad Constantine, Action Saxon, Dalton, aka Chev
Max
Matic,
Verstappen's
Daniel
excellent result
Tavares,
today
Dina,
sees him take
Dina81,
over as
Diggsy
leader
B,
of the
Game
Drivers'
Apologist, Gary
Championship.
Pinkett, Ian Quell,
So, Anthony
Intrigue
Davidson,
Gaming,
who would you
James
rank as
Manchild,
your driver
Jabba
of the
Al
day?
Aiden,
Well,
James,
Crofty,
Jeff
Daniel Ricciardo would
Mianowski,
have to be
Jeremy
my driver of the
Rodriguez,
day.
Josh Gibbons,
It's less about what he did
Kingling
right,
Reviews,
but how
Lucas
little he
Softail,
did wrong.
Luke Jorgensen, Man of God 9000, Man Shovel, Matt Jackson, Michael Ridley Dash, Mike Fallon, Mind of the